Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll begin shortly just to give everyone a few more seconds to join. In the meantime, for those of us that are here, please introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. For those just coming in, we're taking a few moments to let the room fill out. We're introducing ourselves in the chat, name, and where you're joining us from. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a few moments. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. For everyone that's coming in, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Eric Montenegro. I am the Vice President of Program Evaluation and Impact Measurement and Management at Opportunity Finance Network. I am very, very excited to share our interim evaluation findings on OFN's Flagship Finance Program with you all, especially since we just published the evaluation report last week. So it's hot off the press. Next slide, please. For those who might be familiar with OFN and those who might not, it never hurts to have a refresher. But Opportunity Finance Network is a leading national network of more than 490 community development financial institutions, or CDFIs for short. And our members are nationwide. OFN was founded in 1985, and over those 41 years, our team has helped OFN partners invest in CDFIs to catalyze change and create economic opportunities for people and places that are not served by traditional finance. Within OFN, I also want to give a shout out to the research team, which I'm a part of. We engage in three main areas of work, as you see on the slide. First is field building research, which designs and conducts original research examining CDFIs and their value, as well as builds knowledge about and for the CDFI industry. The second area of work is data collection and analysis, which designs and administers original data collections and conducts quantitative and qualitative, as well as geographic analysis. If any of you have filled out our annual member survey, it falls under this category. And lastly is the area that I lead, which is evaluation and IMM. We oversee and conduct program evaluations and measure impact across OFN activities and provide thought leadership and build capacity for the industry. Collectively, we engage in original research efforts, creating practical resources, and forging strategic partnerships. Our publications can be found on OFN's website, including the evaluation report that we will be discussing today. And we've had a couple of other publications recently with a couple more in the pipeline as well for the rest of the year. So please do keep checking back on our website periodically to stay in the know of our latest research. Next slide, please. So now that you know a bit about us, the rest of our journey together over the next hour or so, we'll start with relevant background information on the program, including data on program activities from 2020 through midway through 2025. Then we'll chat about the evaluation design a bit more to give background on the overall evaluation effort and the process that we went through, including some future steps that we have planned in the evaluation. Afterwards, we'll focus on a brief overview of select findings from the benchmark analysis, which are at the center of the current phase of the evaluation. Now, we won't cover all of the evaluation findings because we do want to encourage you to check out the full report, but we will focus on sharing findings that we think most audience members will find interesting. The second half of our time together will be a panel discussion featuring three excellent panelists that we're very lucky to have today. It will be Megan Tier, Managing Director at Wells Fargo in Community Lending and Investment, Emerson Seconds, Chief Executive Officer at Northwest Access Fund, and Ethan Penfield, who is the Vice President and Senior Investment Officer at OFN. Lastly, we plan to have some time to answer any questions that you might have, so please do use the Q&A function of Zoom to send us your questions. Next slide. And before we continue with the content, I want to take a moment to explain why the program that's at the center of the evaluation is discussed in very broad or generic terms. Many of you may know that from 2020 through 2025, OFN had a flagship program called the Finance Justice Fund, or FJF for short. In fact, the program started with a pilot phrase known as Grow with Google in 2020. And similarly today, the program is currently evolving into its next phase, including broadening its impact mission and scope to meet the evolving needs of our members and the industry. And with that evolution also comes a new name that's still being finalized today. So to avoid any confusion, and as we evaluate multiple phases of the program and informing its future, the evaluation in this presentation refers to FJF in its different phases and generic terms, specifically as OFN's financing program, or simply as the program. After all, what matters for the evaluation is not the name, but the program itself and its enduring impact. So now we're ready to talk about OFN's financing program. Next slide, please. As a bit of background, the program launched in 2020 as a bold response to deep-seated inequities around access to capital, and also as a part of the multi-pronged industry response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A key aspect of the program was to mobilize capital, but doing so in an intentional way, into communities often overlooked by mainstream finance, including Black, Latina, Native, low-income, low-wealth, and rural communities. A relatively unique element of the program is the vehicle through which funds are deployed. OFN uses a loan with a stapler grant model, where grants are automatically kind of stapled on to every loan so that CDFIs receive both. There isn't a separate loan and a separate grant program. It's intentionally one program to help both with lending and with capacity building for the CDFIs. Further, to achieve its goals, the program set out a really visionary target that's still going on today: to deploy $1 billion to CDFIs that could meet the moment, while also focusing on making capital available for smaller CDFIs which have a harder time securing funding. Next slide. So what has the program done as a whole since then? Well, the evaluation looked at aggregate data from January 2020 through May 2025, and we found that the financing program has distributed $436 million to 191 unique CDFIs via 223 different awards. And these numbers have grown since then. By May 2025, the program disbursed $383 million in loans and the remaining $53 million in grants. The average loan size is $1.7 million, and the average grant was just shy of $239,000. Overall, midway through 2025, OFN has raised $483 million in capital for the program, and that number is also higher now, almost a year later, getting us closer to $500 million, which shows the continued commitment to this program by both OFN and its partners. Of the CDFIs that have received program funding, about 66%, or 146 CDFIs, are what traditionally are considered small CDFIs, those with less than $50 million in total assets. Going deeper, 40% of funding, or 91 awards, went to CDFIs with less than $25 million in total assets. Additionally, I also want to point out that 45% of CDFIs that received funding were led by a person of color, where 20% had CEOs who identify as Black or African American, 11% with Latina CEOs, 5% with Native American CEOs, and 6% with Asian or Pacific Islander CEOs. Next slide, please. Well, all of these activities and outcomes are wonderful, right? They all alone do not tell us about the changes they contribute to or how confident we can be in attributing those changes to the program itself. For this reason, OFN is conducting a robust, multifaceted evaluation that is still ongoing. But because this is the first rigorous evaluation into this program, and it comes at a time where OFN is taking lessons learned to inform the future of the program, the evaluation design represents a focused, medium-scale, multi-phase effort that can help inform the program moving forward. Next slide. There were 3 specific goals that we were pursuing with the evaluation. First, we wanted to understand the overall program activity in the aggregate, similar to what we just covered. Second, to determine which outcomes were achieved by program recipients and whether those outcomes can be attributed to the program. Now, the findings that we present today help to advance this goal, but doesn't meet it to its fullest extent, and we'll cover more on that later. Third, we want to better understand the importance and value that the loan and stapler grant model provides beyond that dollar amount. What effect does this have on CDFIs choosing to pursue the program and once they have it? Next slide. Now, trying to achieve all of these goals is a very robust effort, and so we had to break the evaluation up into 3 distinct phases. First is what we're already discussing today, the benchmark analysis. It is an outcomes-focused effort to understand what changes the program helped recipients to accomplish compared to a benchmark group of OFN members that did not receive program awards. I'll dive deeper into the benchmarking approach in the next slides. To accompany the benchmarking efforts and further inform the program's impact, in the next phase of work, we're assessing causality through advanced statistical analyses to better understand which outcomes were directly attributable to the program rather than to other factors. We'll do so by building a matched comparison between program recipients and CDFIs that are matched across multiple characteristics to control for selection and any contextual variables that might influence the outcomes. And one of the reasons for this is that the program has some very specific and potentially in-depth underwriting procedures that CDFIs have to meet, and so we want to make sure that those are not the ones that are also affecting some of the outcomes. Lastly, we're also conducting a qualitative study to dive deeper into the program's loans with stable grants model to understand the value that this brings to CDFIs, like I mentioned before. And we've actually interviewed 7 CDFIs that receive program funding, and we're currently in the middle of analyzing those data, as well as over 100 recipient grant reports to just contextualize what that grant portion meant. Next slide. So speaking strictly about the benchmarking phase and the focus of the report, we designed an intentionally collaborative process, from developing the evaluation plan to collecting data across OFN departments and getting reactions on the findings. We had no less than 3 rounds of intense feedback from both OFN teams and external reviewers who are research practitioners at CDFIs that receive program funding. The main source of data that we used for the evaluation was OFN's annual member survey, which every OFN member is required to complete each year. However, because we relied on annual member survey data, we had to restrict our analysis to 2020 through 2023 because those were the years where we had data on hand at the time. To do the benchmark analysis, we divided program recipients into 3 different cohorts by the year of award disbursement. So not by the year they applied, but the year that they actually received the funds. And this yielded a cohort for 2020, 2021, and 2022. Then we built the benchmark sample of OFN members that did not receive program funding to serve as a comparison. While benchmarking is not causality, comparing program recipients with non-recipients allowed us to understand if outcomes could have happened anyways without program funding, or if there were differences that the program could have motivated, which then could lead us down the road of creating those statistical significant models. Next slide. For the sake of time, we'll get through this slide relatively quickly, but this just gives an overview of the AMS variables that we focused our analyses on because they represent some of the main goals of the program while also giving insight into recipient CDFI financials, downstream outputs, and how they reach communities of interest. We also had to make decisions of what to analyze based on variables for which we had consistent data from 2019 through 23. And lastly, the annual member survey has hundreds of individual metrics. So we also had to limit what we chose to analyze, or else we very likely would still be crunching data and writing the findings. Next slide. Now, I know this table is a little bit overwhelming with a lot of small text. It wouldn't be a research presentation without it, but the focal point is the column highlighted in green. Here we provide a glimpse of the sample that comprised our program recipient group divided across the 3 cohorts by award year and the respective benchmark groups. Overall, the evaluation consisted of 98 recipients, while the benchmark group included 215 CDFIs. The data for each cohort runs, like I mentioned, from award year through 23. So the cohort represents 4 years of data, the 2021 cohort has 3 years of data, and so on. And for both the evaluation sample and the benchmark group, the comparisons were made to their pre-year. So for 2020, we're comparing it to the observed changes from the 2019 data and so forth. Because the 2020 cohort has the longest runway, right? It's 4 years, we will center a lot of our discussion on this cohort. Next slide. Here we give a better understanding of the sample for each cohort by asset size. The blue bars are the number of CDFIs with less than 25 million in assets, and greens are the CDFIs with 25 to 50 million in assets. What we see is that across cohorts, the share of CDFIs with less than 25 million in assets increased, which aligns with the intentionality of the program. Interesting though, what we found is that 1/3 of small CDFIs use program funds to grow their asset size beyond that $25 million threshold by 2023. In comparison, only 13% of the small CDFIs in the benchmark group that did not receive program funds had grown their assets beyond that $25 million threshold by 2023. That's a 20% difference. So right off the bat, we find a sign that the program is supporting CDFIs that are growing and catalyzing funds effectively. Next slide. Now, over the next few slides, we're going to see these charts that show a stacked view of the three cohorts by specific variable. In each chart, the solid line represents the cohort and the dotted or dashed line represents the benchmark group for each cohort. This one on the screen shows changes in capital available for lending, where the chart on the left is by average dollars, while the chart on the right is the percent change. We start with capital available for lending because without money to lend, a CDFI will find it hard to fulfill its mission. So it's important to understand how the financing program could have affected this. Here we see that CDFIs in the 2020 cohort saw the greatest growth, an average of 52 million in growth, representing 83% growth. This was a difference of 32 million more dollars that program recipients had to lend on average compared to OFN members that did not receive program funds. It's a difference of plus 44% growth rate, and that positive trend is observed across all cohorts. Next slide. Creating and retaining jobs are common downstream goals of the CDFI industry, seeking to stimulate employment opportunities in their communities. CDFIs in the 2020 and 2022 cohorts saw sustained increases in job creation and retention of 48% and 56% respectively. And the differences compared to the benchmark groups was large, 65% difference for the 2020 cohort and 86% for the 2022 cohort. Curiously, across all benchmark groups, we see a negative trend where they are all creating or retaining less jobs than in their pre-award year. The financing program seems to have contributed to recipient CDFI's ability to mitigate or completely counter those negative trends. Looking at the 2021 cohort in purple, we see that although recipient CDFIs created or retained less jobs by 2023 compared to their pre-award year, these dips were not as extreme as the benchmark group, and their job creation and retention rates actually stayed pretty close to even. Next slide. In terms of housing, we saw consistent growth in housing units developed by recipient cohorts relative to the benchmark groups. For this variable, we're going to ignore the 2020 cohort because most of those recipients were small business lenders that didn't do any housing lending or very little of it in the pre-award year. So any small increases in housing activity will show up as those huge percentages, right? But for later cohorts that were more balanced, we still see a positive trends compared to the benchmark group. Specifically, a plus 27% difference in housing units developed for the 2021 cohort and a plus 4% difference for the 2022 cohort. The program seems to be helping address the affordable housing crisis across the country. Next slide, please. Given how small business lending was a focus area of the program, we also wanted to understand some of the small business lending patterns. The 2020 cohort gave us the clearest opportunity to understand some of these outcomes, so we're going to use them as kind of this deeper dive on this slide. And overall, we observed the program recipients lent on average 24 million more dollars to small businesses than the benchmark group, and almost 22 million more dollars went to entrepreneurs and business owners who identify as persons of color, and 22 million more dollars also went to female entrepreneurs compared to the benchmark group. Next slide. Lastly, for findings, we also sought to understand how well recipient CDFIs use program funding to attract other sources of capital. We calculated this by adding the loan and stable grants that recipients received, then dividing that amount by the total capital available for lending at the time of award, which provided a percent of how much of their overall lending capacity the program funds comprised. Using this method, we found that the 2020 cohort almost doubled their original investment representing an additional $3.5 million raised per CDFI on average, on top of the $4.2 million original investment. And collectively, the 2020 cohort also raised an additional $74.5 million. The 2021 cohort raised $47 million on top of the original investment, and the 2022 cohort has raised $25 million. Now, what you'll notice is that the percentages are higher for the 2022 cohort, but this is because the award sizes have gone down, have been lower with each subsequent cohort. So even though they have raised $22 million, which is less than the 2021 cohort, their percentage is higher because they're matching that original investment much quicker. Next slide. So what does it all mean? The evidence so far shows that the program has been an effective vehicle to drive capital to CDFIs starved of flexible funding, often reaching deeper to institutions and communities of interest than otherwise would have happened without such a program. For example, CDFIs that received the program, their assets and capital available for lending nearly doubled for the 2020 cohort, and large increases have been observed across all cohorts. Relatedly, CDFI recipients have been responsible financial stewards, helping to leverage and bring in additional funds that nearly double the original investment. And lastly, program funds have helped to create or sustain more jobs that otherwise would have not have happened without these funds. So through the program, OFN is helping to catalyze meaningful change and growth for recipients and their communities. Next slide. And with that, I would like to welcome our panelists to turn on their cameras and join the conversation. I am very excited to welcome Megan Tier, the Managing Director of Wells Fargo Community Lending and Investment, who is a funder of this program. Next is Emerson Seconds, the Chief Executive Officer of Northwest Access Fund, which are an OFN member and program recipient. And then Ethan Penfield, OFN's very own Vice President and Senior Investment Officer, providing the perspective of OFN's investment services, which create, execute, and sustain this program. Welcome to the virtual podium.
Thank you.
And I think we can take down the slides. Thank you so much. I want to kick off our discussion with Ethan. Since this is an OFN program now in its 6th year, I think it'd be good to have a little bit more history to contextualize the findings and the discussion. Ethan, could you please share a bit more context on the program's history and how it came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Eric. I think the answer to this is going to be pretty short because it's something that won't be surprising. What I think helped make this program come to be is the fact that OFM was just meeting the moment. We all remember how things were back 2019, 2020, and we had COVID hit and other things going on, and so funders and investors came to OFN looking to get capital out the door to small businesses and nonprofits. And so that was a fortunate position that OFN was in to be able to have those funders, investors stepping up to the table. And through that, we were able to raise substantial capital for low rate long-term loans as well as grants. And that was what gave birth ultimately to this loan and grant model that the report talks about.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ethan. Yeah, big thank you to our partners as well that saw value and joined us in trying to meet this mission. This next question is posed first to Megan and then to Emerson. But given the various evaluation findings that we just presented, could you please share a few takeaways or reflections from the findings? Like what stood out to you? Did any of the findings surprise you? If so, why?
Thanks, Eric, and great to be here today. I wouldn't say there were any surprises. I would say one of the things that stood out is the clear growth trajectory among the smaller CDFIs. And of course, this was one of OFN's main goals, was to really reach that smaller end of the spectrum in the industry. And I know there are differing opinions about whether the industry needs as many CDFIs as it has, but I think it's heartening to see that these smaller groups are really dynamic and have a path toward growth with that kind of seed funding. We've always had a diverse portfolio with a range of sizes of CDFIs at Wells, but it is challenging to maintain a really granular portfolio. So we really appreciate that OFN is able to reach CDFIs that we can't and that other funders maybe can't. And I know you're still, looking more closely at causality, but it really does seem like having OFN funding is kind of a seal of approval that has helped CDFIs attract other funding.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And something curious that we found is that when you pool the total asset sizes of those CDFIs that have less than 25 million in assets, their aggregate is about 700 million. But when you pool all of program recipients that had 50 million or more in total assets, their aggregate is 9.8 billion. So that is a huge difference between how much resources each of these are working to, and speaks to like the urgency of programs like this. But Emerson, here's a similar question to you. What stood out to you about the findings, or what reflections come to mind when reading the interim evaluation findings?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Just as a little bit of background about Northwest Access Fund, the CDFI that I run, we're a consumer lender that does assistive technology financing and small business for people with disabilities. So we are one of the smallerish CDFIs that has a very kind of niche market and requires a lot of different technical assistance that this kind of program investing in is really important because there aren't a lot of opportunities to as a smaller CDFI often to get this kind of ability to apply for capital. And so the thing that stood out for me most from the cohort is kind of the difference from the benchmark going from one year to the other about how folks were able to leverage this investment. And why we applied for it was basically us hoping for all of the results that we're kind of initially seeing, or the differences, is to grow our net assets, our ability to leverage this to be able to get more capital in the door for more programs, and to be able to use the grant to be able to lower our cost of capital and serve our in-depth technical assistance. And so I think that stood out. We are a year into our cohort, I guess, and look forward to being evaluated down the line and meeting the moment. So I'll pause there. I have more later.
No, that's great, Emerson. I think I want to pull a little bit more on that thread. So could you share a bit more about the value that this program has brought to your organization?
Yeah, definitely. So the underwriting process was rigorous. It was definitely fair and asking all of the right questions. But as a smaller CDFI, developing that infrastructure to be able to answer more of those questions as we're kind of leveling up, so to speak, with other funders and other financiers, and really integrate that reporting schedule and the covenants and tracking and all of that kind of stuff. This investment has really helped us to get further down the line in our own internal systems. It has also allowed us to have the kind of OFN through that process stamp of approval. We know that OFN's an organization that's going to make good investments, and so us receiving an award was great for us to be able to say, "Hey, your investment's in good hands. We're on the growth trajectory ourselves." For us, also, job retention actually really stood out to me in the report, or in job growth. I think job retention has been more of our model right now, since what's up in the air right now with the CDFI fund and that funding. But we have not had to lay anybody off, and we've been able to really kind of keep our programs going, our outreach going, and massively increase our development services in this time. And having investments like this where it's paired with a grant has really been great for us to be able to leverage that.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you so much. And I want to stay on this theme of value. So Ethan, I'll pose this to you from the OFN perspective. But what value would you say the program has brought to OFN as an organization, and potentially kind of echoing some of the points that Emerson brought up, anything that you've heard from OFN members in terms of value?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what Emerson just said, reflects the value of this program to OFN because, after all, we are a membership organization, not just a financial institution. And, I think, the takeaway for us, kind of big picture, really is that this, report helps to validate the success of our financing program and the loan and grant model. I think the report said that the amount of financing that we deployed in the 5-year window went to almost 200 CDFIs, and Northwest Access is one of them. I mean, I have probably worked with close to 100 CDFIs in one way or another, not just underwriting. And so, this report really just shows the impact that you would assume. I would assume in my capacity that if I'm working with CDFIs to provide loans and grants, but also some of the other things that Emerson mentioned in terms of, there's a capacity building element to working through the underwriting process that we have and being a borrower of ours that helps CDFIs. And it stands to reason that there's going to be some impact there, but you don't know until you really analyze it. And that's what this does, is it analyzes things, of course, in a benchmarking way, but that really helps to confirm for us, the success of this program. In terms of another kind of success story with another CDFI that we've worked with, there's a borrower in the South that had a pending application in a bank with a bank at the time that they were going through underwriting with us. And we were able to not only do the underwriting and provide the loan and the grant at the end of it all, but we connected them with development services at OFN, the toolkits that we have available there. Ultimately got the loan and grant approved. 6 months later, they were able to close that other loan with the bank that had been pending at the time that they were working through underwriting with us. And they also were approved to participate in the SBA 504 program. And so while I would like to take credit for that, or for OFN and investment services, it's not all us that drove that, but that CDFI CEO did talk in one of our regional meetings about the role that OFN played in helping them accomplish those other objectives. That I think is just yet another success story that helps to validate for us, what this program means to OFN, because it's ultimately what it means for our members.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think we'll stick with you, Ethan, because I think you can also chime in on some of the foci of the next phase of the evaluation, right? Where we're trying to hone in a little bit more on some of the value that the program loan plus grant model brings, especially in the qualitative phase, where recipients get that stapler grant, right, to go alongside the loan. Could you share a bit about that program structure? What makes the program design unique with that loan and stapler grant attached that might not be kind of commonplace in the CDFI industry or in lending in general?
Yeah, so the loan and grant model, I think, it's something that we see, OFN itself will get loans. We'll get some grants from our investors and funders. Other CDFIs have done the same. They've gotten loans, they've gotten grants from partners of theirs. But I think what makes this loan and grant model unique for OFN is the fact that we were able to do it as a package deal. Over the 5 years that we're talking about, it was every CDFI that came to us, we were able to say, okay, here's the loan. They apply for what they want to use the loan for and simultaneously request a grant and say what they want to use that for. And it comes, as you say, it's kind of stapled onto the loan. And there are no requirements. They have a lot of flexibility. They can specify what they want to use it for. They want to use it to support investing in staff, improving systems, additional lending, supporting a complementary product to what they want to use the loan proceeds to support, and so on and so forth. Lots of flexibility, and it's a package deal at scale across a significant number of CDFIs, and it's really effective. And I think, as Emerson just mentioned before too, when you extend a loan to a CDFI, that grows the total asset base, not the net asset base. That can put pressure on their on capital ratios. When you get a grant that comes with the loan, you can help to offset that and help preserve, the sort of the capital ratio positions of the CDFI. So there are so many ways that you can use it. And it's been really effective, I think, in empowering our CDFI borrowers, to use the money in ways that are most impactful for them. And again, I think it's to some extent the findings of this report, show that the success of the loan and grant model in helping CDFIs continue their growth and continue to reach communities that need their support.
Yeah, and that triggered a couple of things in conversation that I've come up with conversations with some of the CDFIs, but I want to hear from Megan first before I share. From the funder perspective, is there anything that stands out to you about the program's loan plus grant model? And perhaps what else would you like to understand about the program's model that maybe research could answer?
Yeah, well, first I would echo a lot of what was just said. We certainly think combining debt and grants is really effective. We did this very intentionally under our diverse community capital program a few years ago, and it worked really well. I think it's one thing to create a new product, for example, but there are all these other complementary needs like staffing and marketing that also need funding. So the combination dovetails well. And I would say also, I think that innovation often grows out of the ideas that need the grant funding first. So under our DCC program, the applications came in actually for grant money. And then we would come in and see if we could also provide some debt. And so we don't have quite a specific intentional program like that right now, but we do still really try to complement each other between the lending and the grant side, really to maximize those resources. On the research side, I know you guys are still looking deeper into causality, but they're clear anecdotal results from the study that CDFIs have been able to, for example, add a key staff person or create a responsive product with the OFN funds. So I think from a research perspective, if there's a way to get at how much the grant portion helped activate kind of the efficacy of the loan portion, that could be a really meaningful piece of evidence to take to all kinds of funders. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? But I think the more you can show around that causality, the better.
Yeah, and that'll definitely be one of the focal points into diving deeper with the differences analyses, but also trying to match some of the interview results with the broader grant narratives that we've received. And indeed, some of the conversations that we've had with CDFIs that received program funds, as you can imagine, there was overwhelming approval for this type of model, right? With most of them saying that, of course, they want more of these types of programs that include those automatic stapler grants. But I also heard from some recipients that the model itself was a determining factor for why they chose to pursue the funding in the first place. So Emerson, I'm curious from the CDFI perspective, could you share a bit about what makes this program model especially useful for CDFIs?
Yeah, I can definitely bring kind of the small to mid-size perspective from that because there are not a lot of opportunities for capital where there's an application process and that is paired with the grant. And so sometimes when you're a growing CDFI, figuring out how to get into the room, how to talk to the contacts, you're still developing that. And so having OFN have kind of an application process in and of itself was great for us to be able to seize an opportunity that was out there. And for us, matching funds for the grant was great for just actual, operational, lowering cost of capital assets along those lines. But also, this last CDFI award period was our first time being a core. So we had been a small and emerging CDFI before that, and so now we've kind of graduated into a core, where we now have to do matching funds, non-federal matching funds, to be able to, for every dollar we get from the CDFI fund, we have to show a dollar in an investment from someone else that's, either a grant or a loan. And so this actually really helped us towards that end to be able to show more investors and to kind of add to that matching funds ability. So I think that was one of the great perspectives. The flexibility that Ethan mentioned about the funds was great. It overall allowed us to be able to deploy capital where we might have had gaps in products. For we had a funder that does small business or a funder that does assistive technology. And so with our opportunity loans, which are for security rental deposits and car repairs and those kind of things, we don't always have a full capital there. And so we would be able to use this for that where we best saw fit in the management of the program. And so really it's the process of doing the application and getting it all together was a value to us. The actual loan capital as well as the grant was a value to us. And yeah, now we are leveraging, and I did mention it the other day in a meeting with a funder that we had received funding from OFN, as kind of a signal of, we're not very small as we once were. We're kind of moving up, and your impact will be able to be magnified as we grow as well. And so really, yeah, I'm excited again to be the part of the research cohorts there of the future. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to come knocking at some point in the future. But that echoes some of what we've heard, right? Where for a lot of newer, smaller CDFIs that receive funding, this initial experience was kind of the first real foray into like rigorous underwriting. And a lot of them felt like they were being put through the ringer. But on the other side, they were more prepared for future funding. They felt a bit more confident, and it did help. So that's even that capacity of knowing what to expect, how to talk about yourself, what documents to prepare, everything under the sun that was required for these, I think ended up building a good capacity experience for people. And Megan, hearing about this value add makes me wonder a little bit about how do initiatives like OFN's financing program help support Wells Fargo's broader impact goals? Like, why did Wells Fargo decide to provide debt capital and grant funding to the program? And were your goals for providing that funding realized?
Yeah, good question. So, we've been talking about funding smaller CDFIs, and it's important to the field. It's important to us, as I've said. But I think it's helpful to have an intermediary that does so as well, or more than one intermediary. And there are differing opinions about the use of intermediaries in the industry, but I think what this program shows is that there are opportunities for groups like OFN to really capitalize on these kind of watershed moments that we've been living through. So the pandemic, for example, to really aggregate funding, including from newer entrants to the field. So for us, we were fortunate to have a significant amount of funding during the pandemic to put toward the CDFI industry through our Open for Business Fund, which was capitalized by our gross PPP fees. And so our foundation distributed a lot of that to individual CDFIs, but we also gave a large grant to OFN toward this work for precisely that reason, that kind of ability to aggregate in the moment, in a time of high need. And then I think also, we funded the Next Awards for a long time, back in the day, and those were competitive awards and they were focused on innovation. And I think while that's still, innovation is still worth highlighting, the industry has shown that innovation is just part of its DNA, and what it needs most is just more capital. So again, I think that aggregation piece was important to us on both the grant and the debt side. Obviously, OFN's a big partner to us in a number of programmatic ways. So we were glad to be able to be part of that aggregation and bring some capital, obviously from an existing funder, but hopefully help attract newer funders as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Emerson, thinking of those impact goals and initiatives that Megan mentioned, and certainly from OFN's perspective, right? CDFIs have proven to be good partners in helping funders and investors meet their goals, but we also want to make space to understand CDFI's needs so they can continue to be good partners, especially with the mission of OFN's financing program in mind. So Emerson, how can future programs and perhaps funders, investors, and intermediary organizations like OFN, how can these better help CDFIs meet their missions? What needs do you foresee and perhaps want to raise?
Yeah, so I think that in general, the recognition that from a smaller CDFI perspective, there's often more technical assistance that is needed for the folks that we serve. We serve low-income people with disabilities, and so you've got folks on the high end of technology adoption, and then you have folks that don't have access to computers or anything like that that are in need of kind of very impactful resources. And so I think this recognition of the grant plus the loan really shows that there are TA needs and there are operational needs that do can impact your self-sufficiency. And so really I think there are, different opinions about intermediaries, but for small CDFIs, really having that kind of call for an application can feel a little bit like it's leveling the playing field because it's not some person that you met at coffee in the line of a conference. It's someone that you can show your stuff to, you can give a presentation to, and really a vision of where you're going. So I think that's important, and innovation really is a part of CDFIs, and really figuring out how to fund that is constantly kind of where I'm at. I know that since we've received this, we've increased our small business loan amounts from kind of a 10,000 very micro entrepreneur, gig economy, supplementing maybe some benefit income, to now we're doing $60,000 loans for adult family homes and for transportation businesses that are serving people with disabilities. And now we're looking to do maybe ADU financing as well. And so kind of having various opportunities across all different types of spheres as funders is going to be great. But yeah, again, it does. I feel like sometimes we're in right now at the level where that we find a lot of our low income clients or moderate income clients rather falling into is that we're making just a little bit too much money for the kind of maybe some support and assistance, and we've not yet made enough money to kind of really be able to kind of grow to the where we are and having a self-sufficiency ratio that can really sustain the organization for the long haul. So these kind of opportunities are very important for us as we get there, and I can see it. I can see that on the horizon. I can see us getting there, and just now we're building towards that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I took down a couple of notes myself, but I appreciate you sharing that. I think I saw a question in the chat talking about what's in the future for this program. And so I think, Ethan, this is right for you to answer. What might you be able to share about the future of OFN's financing program as its next evolutionary phase and name ends up being? But what can we be excited for?
Yeah, let me tell you the future. What we have coming up in the future. Well, I mean, one thing is really just kind of, again, looking at this report, and again, hearing some of the things that Emerson just said too, like this stuff works. The loan and grant model works. It meets a lot of need, and it does so in an effective way. And so our takeaway on that is we'd like to continue to do that. And in fact, many of the CDFIs that we've lent to over the past several years, they're going to have loans coming up, reaching their maturity dates, and some of them already are approaching their maturity dates. We want to be in a position to renew those, and we want to do future financing rounds. We'd like to be able to offer stapler grants in some of the future financing rounds as well. This is our bread and butter work. So that's one thing. I can say that it is our hope that later this year we will be able to open up another financing round. So that's that. I think also, Megan and Emerson talked about innovation. And I think many people know they've heard OFN making announcements under our innovation initiative. And so the on the investment services side, we're also doing some things under that umbrella. We just launched yesterday the interest rate buy down pilot program, and so you may have received that email. If not, you can log into CDFI Connect, and on member only resources, you can find a landing page there with information all about this interest rate buy down program, which is intended to help some CDFIs in addressing cost of capital now on new debt opportunities that they're considering. But that's just one thing. There are some other things. We're doing some work with DAF Giving 360. Recently released a brief on surveys that we did of donor advised funds and their the donors that work with DAF Giving 360. Could be some sort of pilot programs that's come forward from that as well. And other things, if you want to see more information about that, you just go to ofn.org/DAF, DAF, and you can see more information about that. But those are just a few examples. There are other things in the innovation initiative that we will be putting out there. Later this year and going into next year and after. So keep an eye out for those announcements. But yeah, so I would say again, we want to continue to do what works well with the loan and grant model. And we'd like to also continue to explore other innovative capital solutions offerings like the ones I just described and others.
Thanks, Ethan. Another hot off the press announcement. And the OFN team is putting links in the chat for some of that pilot program info and also some information on DApps as well. And Megan, I'll pose the last question to you. And because this is a research webinar, and knowing that Wells Fargo is vested in how these programs are meeting their goals and having an impact on communities, are there any other types of research that you would like to see done on programs like OFN's financing program? Are there any research questions that might be burning, right, that you really want answers to, or ideas for how research can help to inform future commitments to CDFIs?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Being conscious of the fact that the ultimate goal here is looking at the impact on communities, I do have my funder hat on, and I actually think just as part of this conversation today, it would be interesting to actually survey your funders and kind of tease out a bit more that question about the effectiveness of an intermediary model. Perhaps there are funders that would only ever lend to an intermediary, for example, and that would be important to know. The other thing that on a very macro level, I'm always thinking about, and I know there are other researchers working on this as well that could probably use your data set to good effect, is just finding a way to really document and prove how important the CDFI industry is to the financial ecosystem. Like I think we think that it's, or some people think that it's kind of this incidental thing, whereas my theory would be that the research would show that it's become this foundational element, and that if it went away, it would be a big deal. And so getting that, validated through key research that could really prove that, I think would be fascinating.
Noted. Thank you so much for that guidance as well. And we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I saw a couple of questions posed by participants. One of them is, did the benchmark group include OFN members that have other loans from OFN through different programs? At the time when this program started, there were a couple of other on-balance sheet programs that OFN had. To start the program, the organization did double down a little bit on those existing borrowers, right? Organizations that we had high confidence could deploy the money, especially with everything that was going on in 2020, that became imperative. But as we had, more runway and time, we were able to get a little bit more intentional and allow for smaller loans and new borrowers to come in. So given that focus on existing borrowers in 2020, few of them are included in the benchmark group. But for those that are in the benchmark group, this would actually mean that the effect that we saw is underestimated, right? But again, because of these potentially confounding relationships, it's important why that next stage of the evaluation to look at that quasi-experimental design is important, right? So that we can begin to really isolate some of those effects and have high confidence in statements of saying that these outcomes were indeed caused by the program and not necessarily by other confounding variables. Because you can also think of, as Ethan shared, some of our own underwriting requirements, right? And how that means that specific borrowers will be ready to meet those or work through the process would also dictate some of those outcomes. So being able to have more rigorous comparison groups is important. And that also relates to another question in the chat that asks, are you able to share the difference in different specifications used and the levels of significance? And this is not in the report. The current stage is just purely an outcome study, right? Comparing the group that received funding from the program and those that did not. And so those that did not would be the benchmarking group for us to draw that comparison point. In the next run, we do want to do that difference in differences analyses and more stringently match program recipients, which would be the treatment group, to non-recipients so we can have good control and comparison. We actually had to delay doing that different diff analysis by a year because we didn't have enough data to create those comparative match samples with the data that we had on hand. We're hopeful that now that we have another fiscal year of data that we're able to dive in a little bit deeper and start to see which ones of those relationships are indeed statistically significant. And we'll definitely put those results out in a forthcoming report if we find that they are indeed significant. And then I think I saw another question. If a CDFI, could you clarify on eligibility requirements? If a CDFI is supporting underserved communities, i.e. low income, rural communities of color, but has more than 50 million in assets, would that preclude them from applying for future funding in future funding rounds? Ethan, I think this might be ripe for you to chime in. Would the asset size over 50 million in assets stop CDFIs from being eligible for future funding rounds of the program?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is no. It would not preclude you from applying in a future funding round if you're over 50 million in assets. We do set various criteria when we open up financing rounds. And sometimes we have in the past had a cap on total assets for applicants, but not always. And we don't always intend to do that. We always want to find creative ways to serve, our membership, broadly speaking. So while we have been successful at reaching out to smaller CDFIs in recent years, that's not our sole focus. I'm not sure in terms of eligibility requirements if there's a specific program you were thinking of, but specifically with respect to this new interest rate buy down program, you can find that one is capped at 100 million in total assets. And you can find, I think in the chat, there was a link to CDFI Connect to the landing page for that program, where you can see more about eligibility requirements there. But that one, as I said, is not capped at 50. That one is for CDFIs under 100 million in total assets.
Thank you so much for that context, Ethan. We are right at time, so I want to close by saying thank you so much, Emerson, Megan, Ethan. Thank you all for participating as well and being part of the conversation. I am so excited to see this work out. I know we're going to continue to do some of this evaluation, but to me, it means a lot to have this conversation started. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.